It started with a question Peter wasn't ready for. He was walking through the streets of Capernaum, the town he knew better than any place on earth, the town where his house stood, where his boats had once been pulled up onto the shore, where his entire life before Jesus had played out in the rhythms of fishing and family and the slow accumulation of a reputation as a steady, capable man. And someone stopped him. Officials. Tax collectors. Not the Roman kind, but the kind connected to the temple in Jerusalem. The men responsible for collecting the annual contribution that every Jewish man was expected to pay toward the maintenance of the temple and its services. And they asked him a question that was not really a question. Does your teacher pay the temple tax? Peter answered without hesitation, yes. He said it quickly, maybe too quickly. Maybe with the instinctive defensiveness of someone who senses, beneath the surface of an ordinary administrative inquiry, something else, a test, an accusation, an attempt to find grounds for criticism. Peter said yes because the alternative, saying no, or saying he wasn't sure, or admitting he had not thought about it, felt like it would open a door he did not want opened. He answered for Jesus before Jesus had said anything. And then he went home, and Jesus was already there. And before Peter could say a word, before he could even raise the subject, Jesus asked him a question of his own, a question that revealed he already knew exactly what had just happened in the street. A question that was about to turn an awkward administrative moment into one of the strangest and most wonderful miracles in the entire gospel. A question about kings and sons and who exactly owes what to whom. To understand what was actually being asked of Peter in that street, you need to understand what the temple tax was. Every Jewish man over the age of 20 was expected, according to long-standing tradition rooted in Exodus 30, to contribute a half shekel annually toward the maintenance of the temple in Jerusalem. Its sacrifices, its operations, the enormous logistical undertaking of keeping the central institution of Jewish worship functioning for the benefit of the entire nation, including those scattered across the diaspora who might never see the temple in person. This was not a small thing. The half-shekel tax was a marker of belonging, of participation in the covenant community. Paying it was a way of saying, I am part of this. I contribute to the maintenance of the place where heaven and earth meet, where the sacrifices are offered, where the presence of God dwells among his people in the way the scriptures describe. To not pay it, or to be perceived as not paying it, carried implications. It could be read as a statement, a distancing, a signal that you considered yourself outside the system, or above it, or opposed to it. The tax collectors who approached Peter in Capernaum were almost certainly aware of the tension that had been building around Jesus. The growing criticism from religious authorities, the accusations of blasphemy, the questions about whether this man operated within the bounds of acceptable Jewish religious life or outside them. Does your teacher pay the temple tax? This was not idle curiosity. This was the kind of question that, depending on the answer, could become evidence. Evidence in an ongoing, unspoken case being built about who Jesus was and whether he respected the institutions and traditions that defined Jewish religious identity. Peter said yes. He said yes, probably because he believed it was true, because whatever else Jesus was doing that put him at odds with certain religious authorities, Peter likely had no reason to think Jesus was making some kind of statement by refusing to pay a tax that every observant Jewish man paid as a matter of course. Jesus had, after all, been teaching in synagogues, participating in Jewish religious life, engaging with scripture and tradition in ways that, however controversial his interpretations, did not suggest a wholesale rejection of the system. So Peter said yes, quickly, reflexively, and then he had to go home and figure out how this was actually going to happen. If this story is already drawing you in, if you've ever answered for someone else before thinking it through and then had to face the consequences, subscribe right now. Because what Jesus says next is going to completely reframe the question Peter just answered. Peter walked into the house, and before he could say anything, before he could explain the encounter in the street, before he could even raise the topic, Jesus spoke. "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth collect customs and taxes? From their sons or from others?" Peter answered, probably without much hesitation, because the answer was obvious to anyone who understood how taxation worked in the ancient world. From others, of course. Kings did not tax their own children. The royal family was exempt from the obligations that fell on ordinary subjects. The son of a king lived in the king's house, ate at the king's table, and did not pay the king for the privilege of being his son. Taxation was something that happened between rulers and the ruled, not within a family. "Then the sons are free," Jesus said. And there it was, the whole logic of the situation, laid out in a single exchange. If the temple was, in some ultimate sense, the house of God, and if Jesus was, in the way the Gospels have been building toward and revealing in layers throughout the narrative, the Son of that God in a way that went beyond the ordinary use of the term, then the question of whether Jesus should pay a tax to maintain his own Father's house carried an irony that the tax collectors in the street had no idea they were walking into. The Son does not pay tax on the Father's house. The Son is, in some sense, the one the house belongs to. This is not a small theological point buried in an administrative anecdote. This is one of the more understated and yet remarkable claims to identity that Jesus makes anywhere in the Gospels. And he makes it not in a sermon, not in a confrontation with religious leaders, but in a quiet conversation with Peter about a tax bill. The claim is almost hidden inside the ordinariness of the moment, but it is there, unmistakably there, for anyone paying attention. The sons are free, but then Jesus said something that turned the theological point into something almost playful. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth, and you will find a coin. Take it and give it to them for me and for you. This phrase deserves its own moment of attention because it reveals something about the character of Jesus that is easy to miss amid the strangeness of the miracle that follows. So that we do not give offense to them, Jesus had just established, in the clearest possible terms, that he was not actually obligated to pay this tax. The theological logic was sound, and Jesus had stated it plainly. He was the Son. The temple was, in the deepest sense, his Father's house. The sons are free. And then, having established his right not to pay, he chose to pay anyway. Not because he owed it, not because failing to pay would have been wrong in some absolute sense, but because paying it would prevent unnecessary offense. Because there were people, the tax collectors, the broader community, the network of relationships and reputations that made up the social fabric of Capernaum and the wider Jewish world, for whom Jesus' non-payment would have become a point of contention, a distraction, a controversy that would obscure the actual message he was trying to bring. He had the right to refuse, and he chose, instead, the path of voluntary accommodation. This is one of the more quietly profound moments in the entire gospel narrative, because it models something that runs through the whole of Jesus' life and teaching: the willingness to set aside a legitimate claim, even a true and important one, for the sake of something larger. Not because the claim was false, but because insisting on it, in this particular moment, would have cost more than it was worth. There is a difference between being right and needing to demonstrate that you're right at every available opportunity. Jesus was right about the tax, and he paid it anyway, so that we do not give offense, and then, having decided to pay a tax he did not technically owe, he provided the money in the strangest possible way. Go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth, and you will find a coin. Pause here, because this instruction deserves the same kind of attention that Peter's earlier instruction, put out into the deep water, received in a different story. This is, on the surface, one of the strangest things Jesus says anywhere in the Gospels. Go fishing. With a hook, not a net, the more typical fishing method for the kind of catch that would have fed a family or filled a boat, but a single hook, the kind of fishing that catches one fish at a time. Catch the first fish that bites. Open its mouth. There will be a coin inside, specifically a coin of the exact value needed, a stater worth precisely 2 half shekels, enough to cover the temple tax for both Peter and Jesus. The specificity is almost comic. Not go fish until you've caught enough to sell for the tax money. Not go find work for a day and earn what's needed. Open the mouth of the first fish you catch, and the exact amount required will be there. Peter had been a professional fisherman. He knew better than almost anyone what was and was not normally found in a fish's mouth. He knew the textures and contents of fish from years of cleaning and preparing them. A coin, a piece of minted silver with the specific value needed for this specific situation, was not something that fish naturally acquired or carried. And yet the instruction was given with the same calm, unremarkable confidence that Jesus brought to the instruction about the deep water and the nets that broke under the weight of the impossible catch. We are not told what Peter thought in this moment. The gospel does not record an objection. No, Lord, we have fished all night and caught nothing parallel to the earlier story. Perhaps because Peter had, by this point, learned something. Perhaps because the absurdity of this instruction was by now simply Tuesday. Perhaps because a man who has seen what Peter had seen, by this point in his journey with Jesus, had developed a different relationship with instructions that made no sense. He went to the sea. Comment below right now. Has there ever been a moment when an instruction in your life seemed so strange, so specific, so impossible to explain, that you almost laughed? And then it happened anyway? Tell us, because this miracle is one of the strangest and most personal in the whole gospel. The gospel does not linger on the moment of the catch. It does not describe the cast of the line, the weight, the pull, the reeling in. Matthew's account moves through this with the same brisk economy that characterizes so much of his gospel. Efficient, almost matter of fact, as if the miraculous were simply being recorded as one more item in a sequence of events. Peter cast the hook. He caught a fish. He opened its mouth, and there was a coin, a stater. the exact denomination needed, the exact amount required for two people's temple tax, Peter's and Jesus's, present inside the mouth of a fish pulled from the Sea of Galilee on a single cast of a single hook, on the same day that the question had been asked in the street and the conversation had happened in the house. What do you do with a detail like this? Of all the miracles in the Gospels, this one occupies a strange and almost singular place. It is not a healing. No one's body is restored. It is not a deliverance. No demon is cast out. No storm is calmed. No death is reversed. It is on its face, almost mundane in its purpose. Paying a bill. A relatively small administrative obligation met through an utterly extraordinary means. And perhaps that is exactly the point, because most of the difficulties that fill an ordinary human life are not dramatic. Most of what we worry about is not life-threatening storms or terminal diagnoses or demonic possession. Most of it is smaller than that. Bills, obligations, the quiet grinding pressure of needing money for something specific on a particular timeline with resources that do not currently stretch to cover it. This miracle says something about that category of need. It says, this matters too. The God who calms storms and raises the dead is also the God who is attentive to a temple tax, to a bill that needs to be paid, to the small, unglamorous administrative pressures that make up so much of ordinary life. The miracle was not less because the need was small. The provision was just as specific, just as immediate, just as miraculous for a half-shekel tax bill as it would have been for anything larger. Take it and give it to them for me and for you. This detail is easy to read past, but it carries its own weight. Jesus did not say, take the coin and give it to them for me, and you find your own way to pay yours. He included Peter in the provision. The single coin found in the fish's mouth was enough for both of them. Jesus' tax and Peter's tax covered together from the same unexpected source. Think about what this communicates about the relationship between Jesus and the people who followed him. Jesus had just made an extraordinary claim about his own identity, the Son who does not, strictly speaking, owe tax on his Father's house. And in the same breath, in the same provision, he extended the benefit of that identity to Peter. Not just, I will take care of my obligation, but I will take care of ours. Peter's need was met inside the same miracle that addressed Jesus' situation. The coin that was provided was not divided into two separate provisions, one miraculous and one ordinary. It was a single coin, a single provision, sufficient for both, because Peter's obligation had become, in some sense, part of what Jesus was carrying. This is a small but real picture of something larger that runs through the whole of the gospel. The people who follow Jesus are not left to solve their own administrative problems, while Jesus handles his own separately in a different category. The provision that meets Jesus' situation also meets theirs. What belongs to the Son becomes available to those who are with him. For me and for you, one coin, two obligations, both met.
And
There is something worth sitting with about the specific creature that this miracle involved. Of everything in creation that Jesus could have used to provide this coin, he used a fish. An ordinary fish from an ordinary lake, caught by an ordinary method. A hook and a line, the kind of fishing that an individual does alone for a single catch, rather than the net-based fishing that defined Peter's professional life. And inside that fish, placed there by means the gospel does not explain and does not need to, was exactly what was needed. There is something almost playful about this, almost as if creation itself, the lake, the fish, the whole created order that the Gospel of John tells us was made through this very person, had simply been carrying all along the provision that this particular moment would need. As if the coin had always been there, in some sense, waiting, not for a random fish, for this fish, on this day. At the end of Peter's line, the same God who in the beginning formed the waters and filled them with creatures, the same God whose word brought the Sea of Galilee and everything in it into being, had, in some way the text leaves entirely mysterious, ensured that on this particular day, the provision Peter needed was already present in the world, waiting to be drawn up. This is not a story about God creating something out of nothing in the moment of need, though God can certainly do that too. This is, in a stranger and perhaps more wonderful way, a story about provision that was already there, already present, already part of the world Peter was walking through, waiting for the moment when a hook would be cast, and a fish would rise, and a need would be met by something that had been, in some sense, prepared in advance. Peter paid the tax. We don't know the specific moment, whether he went back to the same officials who had stopped him in the street, or found some other way to deliver the payment, or whether the gospel simply assumes the obvious conclusion and moves on. The text gives us the provision and trusts the reader to understand that the obligation was met and life continued. The conversation that had started with a question in the street, "Does your teacher pay the temple tax?" ended with the tax paid, the question answered, and no offense given to anyone who might have made something of the answer. But something had happened in between that went far beyond a tax payment. Jesus had revealed something about his own identity, quietly, almost in passing, in a domestic conversation about money. The son does not owe tax on the father's house. And then he had chosen, freely, to pay anyway, modeling a willingness to set aside a legitimate claim for the sake of peace, for the sake of not becoming a distraction, for the sake of the larger purpose that mattered more than being technically right. And then he had provided, in a way so specific, so personal, so attentive to the smallest details of an ordinary financial obligation, that the provision itself became a kind of teaching, a demonstration that nothing is too small for the attention of the one who made the sea and everything in it, that a half-shekel tax bill is not beneath the notice of the God who calms storms and raises the dead. This story has reached people for 2,000 years, not because it is the most dramatic miracle in the Gospels, it isn't, but because it is, in some ways, the most relatable. Most of us are not in the middle of life-threatening storms most days. Most of us are not standing at the bedside of someone who has just died. But most of us, at some point, have looked at a bill, an obligation, a payment due, a number that needs to come from somewhere and currently has no obvious source, and felt the particular grinding anxiety of not knowing how it's going to get covered. This story says, That matters too. The provision may not look like a coin in a fish's mouth. It rarely does. But the same attention, the same willingness to meet a need that seems too small to bother God with, the same God who is not too large or too busy or too occupied with cosmic matters to notice a tax bill in Capernaum. That attention is the same attention this story has always pointed toward. Take it and give it to them for me and for you, for me and for you. Whatever the obligation is, whatever the bill, whatever the small, grinding, administrative pressure that has been sitting on you, too ordinary to pray about and too persistent to ignore. The same God who provided a coin in a fish's mouth on an ordinary day in Capernaum is not too large to notice it. For you too. If this story reached something in you today, if you've been carrying an obligation that feels too small to bring to God and too big to ignore, please share this video with one person who needs to hear that nothing is too small for God's attention. Leave a comment below. Tell us about a time provision showed up in a way you never expected, something so specific, so well-timed, that you couldn't explain it any other way. Comment for me and for you. If you believe the same provision is available for what you're carrying right now, subscribe. Because every story in this series is about the moment the impossible became specific, personal, and exactly enough. The coin is already there, waiting to be found.